Clayton wasn't looking for trouble. But out here, in the vast, unforgiving expanse where law was just a rumor and survival was a daily prayer, trouble had a way of finding you. He reined in his horse, a sharp, practiced tug, his eyes locking onto a dark smear against the pale, dusty rock of the path. It was blood, too much of it to be from a coyote or a hawk's kill. This was human. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots barely making a sound on the dry, crackling underbrush. His hand, calloused and steady, found the familiar comfort of the revolver at his hip. He followed the trail, a grim crimson map leading him around a bend of jagged rock and thorny sagebrush. And that's where he saw her, a woman, half hidden in the scrub, her feet bare and bruised, her simple cotton dress torn to ribbons. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across her side, soaking the fabric and the dirt beneath her. For a moment, he thought she was gone. Another forgotten soul swallowed by the harshness of the land. But then her eyelids fluttered. He crouched low, his voice a steady rumble, trying not to spook her. "Ma'am." Her eyes opened, glassy with shock and agony. But there was something else in them, too. A flicker of fierce intelligence. She tried to form words, but all that came out was a dry, hoarse whisper, a sound of pure pain. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the bandana from his neck and pressed it firmly against the wound. "Don't try to move," he said, his voice softer now. "You're safe." She winced as he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was tense, coiled like a spring. The blood, warm and sticky, soaked through his shirt, a stark reminder of how close she was to the edge. He mounted his horse with her cradled against his chest and spurred the animal into a gallop. They flew across the valley, the dry wind whipping at their faces, a race against the setting sun and the life draining out of her. He brought her to the old line shack, a remote bunkhouse where he'd been living alone since the spring thaw, working the cattle lines for a wage. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He laid her gently on his narrow cot, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He stoked the fire, coaxing the dying embers back to life until a warm glow filled the small cabin. She watched his every move, her eyes silent but sharp, tracking him like a cornered animal. He took out his flask of whiskey, not for drinking, but for cleaning. As he gently dabbed at the edges of the wound, he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What happened out there?" Her voice was barely a crackle, but the word was clear. "Ambush." He paused, the whiskey-soaked cloth dripping red onto the floor. "Bandits?" She shook her head, a tiny, pained movement. "Worse. They said the valley's not mine." Clayton froze. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the blood and the torn dress. There was a stubborn set to her jaw, an aristocratic line to her nose. She wasn't some lost traveler. She was someone. "Yours?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded again, a flicker of strength returning. "My father owned it all, passed it down. The deeds. They were in my satchel. They took it." Clayton stared, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd worked these lands for years, riding the fences, branding the calves, always assuming it was owned by some faceless corporation back east. He never once thought to ask the name of the owner. "What's your name?" he pressed, needing to hear it. Her lips parted, and she spoke the name that would change everything. A name that was supposed to be a ghost story. "Ida," she breathed. "Ida Holloway." The name hit Clayton like a physical blow. Holloway, not just any name. The name. The Holloway Ranch, legend had it, once stretched from the snow-capped peaks of Elk Ridge all the way to the murky waters of the River Fork. It was a kingdom of grass and cattle, a territory so vast and rich that men had waged wars for a fraction of it. But the Holloways were gone, wiped out by sickness and tragedy years ago, or so the story went. The last of the line, a daughter, had reportedly fled east, disappearing into the crowded cities, leaving the land to be carved up by vultures. Clayton felt a cold dread creep up his spine. "You're a Holloway?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She managed another nod, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and pain. "They thought I was dead," she murmured, a dark understanding dawning in her gaze. "They shot me and left me for the buzzards." He rose to his feet, a storm brewing behind his eyes. He looked out the small, grimy window of the bunkhouse, at the vast, moonlit valley stretching out before him. Her valley, stolen from her. An entire kingdom seized by men who thought a single bullet could erase a legacy. He turned back to her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his determined face. "Then let's give them a reason," he said, his voice hard as iron, "to wish they'd finished the job." As Ada drifted into a fitful, pain-induced sleep, Clayton stepped out into the cold night air. The valley was bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a full moon, every rock and ravine etched in silver and shadow. It was beautiful, but now it felt tainted. Someone had tried to murder the rightful owner and bury her name in an unmarked grave. But they had failed. She wasn't alone anymore. And if this land truly belonged to Ada Holloway, the men who tried to steal it had just signed their own death warrants. They had made their last mistake. Because what they didn't know, what no one in this valley knew, was that Clayton wasn't just some nameless drifting cowboy. He had a past of his own, a past he'd tried to bury deep, a past that tied him to the Holloway name in a way that would turn this fight for land into a personal war. He looked at his hands, remembering a time when they'd held not a branding iron, but the cold, balanced weight of a lawman's badge. A badge he'd thrown away in disgust. He had run from the corruption, from the kind of men who put a price on justice. But now, it seemed, the past had finally caught up to him. And this time, he wasn't going to run. Clayton rode into the town of Blackbriar as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. Dust plumed behind his horse's hooves, a smoky fuse burning its way toward the heart of the town. His gaze swept the main street, a grim, silent predator. Shutters were drawn tight. Doors were closed. But he could feel the eyes on him, feel the whispers hiding behind the weathered clapboard walls. He tied his reins outside the sheriff's office, the faded paint peeling off the sign. His gut twisted into a knot. He knew men like the one who sat inside this building. He knew them all too well. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Sheriff Dodd sat behind a large oak desk, meticulously polishing a rifle. The rifle gleamed, far too clean for a man in a town this quiet. It was the kind of clean that came from having nothing to do but wait. "Morning, Clayton," Dodd said, his lips pulling back into a smile that was all teeth. It was sharp, predatory, and didn't come close to reaching his cold, dead eyes. "Something you need?" Clayton stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He kept his voice firm, level. Ada Holloway was ambushed on the North Trail. She's alive, but she's hurt bad. Her satchel, the one with her land deeds, is gone. 2 men. They were likely headed back to town. Dodd's smile didn't waver, but his hands stilled on the rifle. For a split second, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Surprise? Crossed his face before being extinguished. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone dripping with false casualness as he set the rifle down. "Well now, haven't seen or heard the Holloway name in years. Thought that girl ran off back east." "She didn't," Clayton said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming as cold as a winter grave. "And someone tried to make sure she was buried here for good." Dodd leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the tense silence. He steepled his fingers, a picture of smug authority. "A lot of folks around here figure that valley is up for claim. Public land now. If this woman is who she says she is, she'd better have proof." "She does," Clayton shot back, and I'm going to get it back for her." The sheriff's folksy demeanor vanished. He leaned forward, his voice lowering into a menacing growl. "You be careful where you go digging, cowboy. Some things in this town were settled a long time ago. Best to let sleeping dogs lie." Clayton met his gaze, his own eyes like chips of flint. "Not if they were settled in blood." He turned and walked out, the weight of Dodd's stare boring into his back. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just spoken to the man who gave the order. The sheriff wasn't just corrupt, he was the kingpin. As he untied his horse, the bat-wing doors of the saloon across the street creaked open. Two men stepped out, squinting in the morning light. One had a jagged, ugly scar that cut across his temple like a bolt of lightning. The other walked with a pronounced limp, his face twisted into a permanent sneer. Clayton recognized the scarred one instantly. He'd seen him a week ago, watching the cattle lines from a high ridge, a human buzzard waiting for something to die. As they walked past him, the limping man deliberately brushed his shoulder. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and malice. "You're riding awful close to a ghost, cowboy," he muttered, just loud enough for Clayton to hear. Clayton's hand instinctively went to his revolver, his fingers twitching over the grip. But he held back. Not here. Not now. A public gunfight was what they wanted. It would give Dodd the excuse he needed to throw him in a cell and let Ida fend for herself. So he just stood there, a statue of cold fury, as they swaggered down the street. But he noticed something, a small detail that sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. On the saddle of the scarred man's horse was a brand, a small, interlocking W inside a circle. It wasn't a local ranch brand. Clayton had seen it before, years ago, in a different territory. It was the mark of the Whitmore Mining and Land Company, a ruthless corporation known for swallowing up entire territories through intimidation, forgery, and, when necessary, violence. This wasn't about a few opportunistic thugs. This wasn't even just about a corrupt sheriff. This was bigger, colder. Ida Holloway hadn't just been ambushed by two men. She had stood in the way of an empire. He swung onto his horse and rode hard, the dust swirling behind him like a storm cloud of urgency. He had to get back to Ida. He had to know what she knew, and he had to prepare for a war that was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Ida was awake when he burst through the door of the bunkhouse. She was pale, her face etched with pain, but she was sitting up, and the fire he'd seen in her eyes before was now burning like a forge. She had wrapped fresh bandages around her ribs, her movements stiff but determined. "I remember their faces," she said, her voice raspy but strong, before he could even speak. One had a scar, like a lightning bolt had struck his head. Clayton nodded grimly, bolting the door behind him. "I saw him in town. Him and his limping partner. They work for Sheriff Dodd." Ida's lips thinned into a hard, unforgiving line. "Then we know where they are. We know who has my satchel." He sat down on the crate opposite her cot, the small space suddenly feeling charged with electricity. "It's worse than that, Ida," he said, his voice low and urgent. The man with the scar, his horse was branded, the Whitmore Company brand. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. "Whitmore, they have no claim here. Their territory is 3 counties over." "Not anymore, it seems," Clayton said. "Dodd isn't just a corrupt lawman lining his own pockets. He's a pawn. He's clearing the way for Whitmore to move in and declare this entire valley forfeit." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "They don't just want your land, Etta. They want to erase the Holloway name from the map so they can claim it all, legally, without any heirs to contest it." A long, heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Etta stared into the flames, her mind clearly racing. The sheer scale of the conspiracy was staggering. It wasn't just a land grab. It was a systematic extermination of her legacy. They had tried to kill her, and now they were using the law itself as their weapon. Then she looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by something harder, something colder. "They think I'm a ghost," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "A problem that's already been solved." She winced as she pulled her coat on over the bandages, her jaw set with a stubborn resolve that defied her injuries. "That gives us an advantage. They won't be expecting me to fight back." Clayton stood and paced by the window, the gears turning in his own mind. He was a lone man, and she was a wounded woman. Against them was a corrupt sheriff, a crew of hired killers, and the vast, shadowy power of the Whitmore Corporation. The odds were impossible. "We'll need more than time," he said, watching the storm clouds that were now gathering over the distant peaks. "We need proof they can't bury. We need allies they can't buy. And we need a plan they won't see coming." Ada's hand moved slowly, carefully to the hem of her torn dress. Her fingers worked at a hidden seam, and she pulled out a small, flat tin box, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. Clayton watched, stunned, as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were papers. Old, yellowed, but perfectly preserved. Each one was marked with the distinctive, elegant seal of the Holloway family. "They took the satchel," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and triumph. "But they didn't get the originals." She held out the papers to him. "My father taught me that you never carry your true wealth where thieves can find it. This is the original royal grant, the foundational deed. It proves the Holloway claim is absolute, predating the territory's founding." Clayton took the deed, his hands reverent. It was more than paper. It was history. It was power. "If we show this in town," he said, thinking aloud, "Dodd and his men will burn it, and us along with it, before you can finish a single sentence." "I know," she said, "which is why we don't go to them." A cunning light sparked in her eyes. "We make them come to us." He looked at her, an eyebrow raised. "How?" She turned her gaze toward the window, out at the vast, sprawling valley that was rightfully hers. "We send a message, not with guns, but with words. We let the ghosts speak." She looked back at him, her plan forming. "You ride. You tell every old ranch hand, every family that was loyal to my father, every man who was squeezed out by Dodd and his cronies. You don't tell them I have the deed. You just tell them one thing." She leaned forward, her voice a powerful, resonant whisper that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. "Tell them Ida Holloway lives, and she's come home." That evening, Clayton became a phantom. He rode not to the main ranches, the ones that had grown fat and prosperous under Dodd's reign, but to the forgotten corners of the valley. He visited the small, hard-scrabble homesteads tucked away in canyons, the line shacks manned by grizzled old-timers, the homes of men who had once worked for Ida's father and had been driven off their land by fear, threats, and rigged finances. At each stop, he dismounted, spoke in low tones, and delivered the same simple, world-shattering message: Ida Holloway is alive. He didn't offer details. He didn't ask for help. He just planted the seed. And then he rode on, a ghost spreading a legend. The next morning, as the sun crested the ridge, they started to arrive. First one, then two, then a dozen riders appearing at the bunkhouse like apparitions materializing from the morning mist. They were older men, their faces weathered maps of hard lives, their eyes wary but filled with a long, dormant fire. They dismounted, hats in their hands, and looked at Ida with a mixture of awe and reverence. One grizzled cowboy, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of work and fighting, stepped forward. His name was Silas, and he had been foreman for Ida's father for 20 years before Dodd had run him off. "We heard you were dead," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Ida, sitting by the fire, and nodded slowly. She has her father's eyes. She's the last Holloway boys, and I swore an oath to her daddy that I'd die before I let scavengers steal this land. A murmur of agreement ran through the group. These were men bound by loyalty, not to a piece of paper, but to a family, a legacy. But as Clayton watched them, he felt a knot of unease. He saw the hope in their eyes, but he also knew the power they were up against, and a dark thought crept into his mind. Were they all here for the right reasons? In a valley poisoned by greed for so long, could every man be trusted? He scanned their faces, searching for any sign of deception, his old lawman's instincts kicking in. For now, they were all she had. By dusk, they had a plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and hinged entirely on the enemy's greed. They would use the thieves' own weapon, disinformation, against them. They would let a rumor slip in town, a carefully crafted lie whispered to the right drunkard. The lie? That Ida had a second, hidden satchel, and that it contained not just the deed, but a detailed ledger kept by her father, documenting every bribe, every land fraud, every crime committed by Sheriff Dodd and his benefactors for the past decade. The bait would be that Ida was going to retrieve this ledger from its hiding place, the old abandoned Holloway barn, the only structure left standing from the original homestead. The valley was now split down the middle. On one side, a handful of loyalists, armed with old rifles and a righteous cause. On the other, a corrupt sheriff, hired killers, and the unseen hand of a corporate giant. Clayton loaded his rifle, the familiar click of the chamber echoing the grim finality of their decision. He turned to Ada, her face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "You sure about this? Once we set this trap, there's no going back." She looked out over the land that was her birthright, her jaw firm, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he had not seen before. "They tried to kill me for my name," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "Now they'll learn what that name stands for." As the moon climbed high into the ink-black sky, they rode out. Ida, Clayton, and a dozen hardened men, a small army of ghosts riding to reclaim their kingdom. What awaited them at the old Holloway barn wasn't just a confrontation. It wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning, long overdue, for a valley whose soul had been stolen by fear. And Clayton knew, as he rode beside her, that this night would either be their salvation or their tomb. But there was another secret, a darker one, that Clayton kept locked away. As he listened to the old ranchers talk, one name had been mentioned, a family name he recognized from a dusty, forgotten file in a marshal's office. A family tied to a violent land dispute with the Holloways a generation ago, a dispute that ended with Ada's grandfather taking possession of their land and the other family disappearing, ruined, and vowing revenge. One of the men riding with them right now, the one who had been the most vocal, the most eager to help, was the last surviving son of that family. Was he here for justice, or was he here for a different kind of reckoning altogether? The trap they were setting for Dodd might just be a trap for them as well. The Holloway barn stood on a low hill, a skeletal silhouette against the star-dusted sky. It was a relic of a lost kingdom, its massive beams weathered by countless seasons, but still proud. High above the great double doors, the Holloway crest, a hawk in flight, was still visible, carved deep into the old wood. It was the only building Whitmore's men hadn't torched, fearing the legends that clung to it like ivy. Clayton, Ida, and their small posse arrived just before the deep dark of the pre-dawn hours. They moved like wraiths, every man a shadow, every hand gripping cold iron. Inside the cavernous barn, the air was thick with the scent of old hay, cedar, and time itself. They planted the bait, a bundle of fake documents tucked inside an old lockbox, positioned just so, visible through a cracked floorboard in the loft above. Ida walked the grounds alone for a moment, her boots silent in the thick dust. She ran a hand along the rough-hewn wall. "My father built this with his own hands," she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "They burned the ranch house, the bunkhouses, everything. But they left this. They were afraid of it." Clayton joined her, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding ridgeline. "They'll come in fast and hard once they hear the rumor," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You sure you want to be seen? We could stay hidden, take them by surprise." Ida shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun would soon rise. "No, let them see me. Let them see what they tried to bury." They didn't have to wait long. The rumor, dropped by one of Silas's men in the Blackbriar saloon, had spread like wildfire. By midday, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced their arrival. It was a war party. Sheriff Dodd led the pack, his face a mask of smug confidence. Behind him rode at least 10 men, including the scarred man and his limping companion. They were armed to the teeth, riding with the swagger of men who believed they were invincible. Dodd dismounted, his rifle held loosely across his chest, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well, look who decided to rise from the grave," he called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "You've got guts, Ada, I'll give you that. But guts don't change the law." Ada stepped out from the shadow of the barn, her posture ramrod straight. She held no weapon. She didn't need one. Her presence alone was a challenge. "The law is only as real as the men who uphold it, Dodd," she replied, her voice ringing out, clear and steady. "And you poisoned it long ago." Dodd's smirk tightened into a snarl. "That fancy talk won't save you, and neither will that old ghost story about a hidden ledger." That's when Clayton stepped out, moving to stand beside her. His rifle was pointed at the ground, but his thumb was resting on the hammer. His message was clear. "She's not alone," he said, his voice a low growl that carried across the yard. "And you're not taking another inch of this valley without spilling blood for it. Your blood." The standoff crackled with a tension so thick you could taste it. It was the silence before a lightning strike. Dodd's men fanned out, their hands hovering over their holsters. On the ridges above, Clayton knew Silas and the other ranchers were hidden, their own rifles trained on the scene below. But Clayton's eyes weren't on Dodd. They were on the man named Jeb, the one whose family had been wronged by the Holloways. Jeb was positioned with the other ranchers, but his rifle, Clayton noted, was angled just slightly away from Dodd's men. It was aimed at the spot where Ida was standing. The trap was about to spring, but who was the hunter and who was the prey? Dodd's patience finally snapped. He raised his hand, his face twisted with fury. "Burn it!" he barked, his voice echoing across the valley. "Burn the barn, burn the deed, and bury the Holloway name for good." The scar-faced man grinned, lighting a torch. He drew his arm back to throw it onto the dry roof of the barn. But before the flame could leave his hand, a shot rang out, not from the ridge, not from Clayton. It came from behind Dodd's own line of men. The torch flew from the man's hand, extinguished in the dirt. Everyone froze. Slowly, the limping man, Dodd's own second-in-command, lowered his smoking pistol. He looked at Dodd, his face a mask of contempt. "There's been a change of plans, Sheriff," he said. Dodd stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. "Kane? What in the hell are you doing?" Kane, the limping man, took a step forward. "Mr. Whitmore is displeased with your performance. He feels you've drawn too much attention to this business. He prefers a quieter, more permanent solution." He then turned his cold eyes on Ida. "He's also doubled the price for the girl, and he wants the original deed, not some mythical ledger." It was a triple cross. Kane wasn't just working for Dodd, he was reporting directly to Whitmore and had been ordered to eliminate his clumsy boss. But the betrayals weren't over. A second shot cracked the air, this one from the ridge. Not at Dodd, but at Ida. The bullet whizzed past her head, chipping a piece of wood from the barn door frame. Clayton reacted instantly, shoving Ida to the ground and firing his rifle toward the ridge. It was Jeb. Just as he suspected, he was using the chaos of Kane's betrayal to take his own shot, to claim his family's revenge. Suddenly, the valley floor erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire. Dodd's men, confused, drew their guns. Kane's faction, loyal to Whitmore's money, started firing on Dodd's men, and from the ridges, Silas and the loyal ranchers opened fire on them all. It was a hornet's nest of crossfire and treachery. Clayton pulled Ida behind the relative safety of an old water trough. "Stay down!" he yelled over the deafening roar of guns. He knew they had only seconds before they were completely overrun. The carefully laid plan had shattered into a dozen deadly pieces. In the midst of the chaos, Sheriff Dodd, realizing he'd been betrayed and outgunned, made a desperate move. He lunged for Ida, grabbing her, pulling her up to use as a human shield. He pressed the barrel of his revolver to her temple. "Everybody stop!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic and rage. "Drop your guns or she dies right here! I'll take her with me!" The shooting sputtered to a stop. An eerie silence fell over the barnyard, thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Kane smirked, lowering his gun. Jeb, on the ridge, held his fire. They were all happy to let Dodd do their dirty work for them. Dodd's eyes were wild, darting between Clayton and the men on the ridge. "It's over, Holloway." He spat at Ida, his face inches from hers. "Your father ruined my family. He didn't just take our land with his fancy lawyers and his political friends. He took our name. He made us into nothing. This was never just about money. This was about retribution." The confession hung in the air, a shocking revelation that reframed the entire conflict. This wasn't just corporate greed. It was a deeply personal, generational vendetta. Clayton stood slowly, his hands raised, his rifle on the ground. His mind was racing, calculating angles, possibilities. He was too far away to risk a shot. "Let her go, Dodd," Clayton said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's me you want. I'm the one who brought her back into this." Dodd laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You? You're just a hired gun. You're nothing. It's the name, the Holloway name. It has to end. Today." But as he ranted, his eyes crazed with hatred, he failed to notice a small movement. Ida, who had seemed frozen in terror, was slowly, deliberately reaching up. Not for his gun, but for the Holloway crest pinned to her father's old coat, the one she wore over her bandages. It was old, heavy silver, with a long, sharp pin. With a sudden, ferocious cry, she jammed the pin deep into the back of Dodd's hand. He roared in agony, his grip faltering for a split second. It was the only opening Clayton needed. His hand blurred, drawing his revolver in a motion so fast it was barely a flicker. The gun bucked in his hand, a single deafening shot that seemed to shake the very heavens. Dodd's head snapped back, a look of pure shock on his face, and he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Kane raised his pistol again, a cold smile on his face. "Well," he said, "that saves me a bullet." He leveled his gun at Ida. "Now, the deed, and then you die." Before he could pull the trigger, Silas and the other ranchers rose from the brush and the ridge lines, a dozen rifles all clicking in unison as they aimed squarely at Kane and his remaining men. Kane's smile vanished. He was surrounded, outnumbered. He slowly, grudgingly, lowered his weapon. The battle for the barn was over. But Clayton knew the war was just beginning. They had killed a sheriff and thwarted a trap, but in doing so, they had declared open war on the Whitmore Empire. And Whitmore was not a man who tolerated failure or opposition. He would not send thugs next time. He would send an army. The air was thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the heavy silence of death. Dodd's men were rounded up, disarmed, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Kane, the treacherous second-in-command, was bound securely, his sneer replaced by a sullen, calculating glare. The greatest shock, however, was when Silas and his men brought down Jeb from the ridge, his rifle confiscated, his face a mask of bitter hatred. Ada stood over Sheriff Dodd's body, her expression unreadable. Clayton came to her side, gently taking the silver Holloway crest from her hand and pinning it back on her coat. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at the fallen sheriff, then at Jeb, who was being tied to a fence post. "He said my father ruined his family," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And Jeb. His family was the Hendersons. My father always told me they lost their land fair and square in a legal dispute." "Maybe it wasn't as square as he said," Clayton replied grimly. He knew from the old files that legal disputes in this territory often involved intimidation and bought judges. He knelt beside Dodd's body and began searching his pockets. This wasn't just a cleanup, it was an investigation. Dodd was getting his orders from someone. If we can prove it— His fingers closed around a folded piece of paper in Dodd's inner coat pocket. It wasn't a letter. It was a telegram. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the brief coded message. Holloway surfaced. Situation unstable. Proceed with final option. Payment on confirmation. W. Clayton muttered. Whitmore. He showed it to Ida. This was the proof they needed, a direct link between the ambush and the corporation. This telegram was their weapon. "What do we do with them?" Silas asked, gesturing with his rifle toward Kane, Jeb, and the half-dozen other captured thugs. Ada looked at the men, her would-be assassins and betrayers. Her jaw was set like granite. "Dodd is dead, but his crimes aren't," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Kane and his men will be taken to the federal marshal in New Houston. They'll stand trial for attempted murder and conspiracy. We have the telegram, and we have their testimony." She then turned her gaze to Jeb. It was a long, silent moment. "What about him?" Silas pressed. "He tried to kill you. He's a traitor." Ada walked slowly toward Jeb, stopping just a few feet from him. "Why?" she asked, her voice not angry, but filled with a deep, sorrowful curiosity. "Why, Jeb?" Jeb spat on the ground. "Your grandfather stole our water rights. Your father foreclosed on our land with a stacked deck. The Holloway name is built on the bones of my family. I wanted what was owed. I wanted justice." Ada stared at him, and for the first time, Clayton saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The world was no longer black and white. "Tying you up and turning you over to the law won't fix what happened to your family," she said slowly. "It will just be more violence, more revenge." She turned to Silas. "Let him go." A stunned silence fell over the group. Silas stared at her, aghast. "Ada, you can't be serious. He's a snake." "And what do you do with a snake?" she replied, her voice steady. "You can kill it, or you can let it slither away. Killing him makes us no better than them. Let him go. Let him live with the fact that his hate failed and a Holloway showed him mercy." She looked directly into Jeb's shocked eyes. "Go. Get out of this valley and never come back. Your war with my family is over." Without another word, Silas's men, looking utterly bewildered, cut Jeb's ropes. He stood there for a moment, rubbing his wrists, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, hatred, shame, confusion. Then he turned and staggered away, a man broken not by a bullet, but by an act of unexpected grace. Clayton watched him go, a slow smile touching his lips. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader. He turned his attention back to the more immediate threat. "Kane won't talk," he said to Ida. "Not unless we can offer him something better than whatever Whitmore is paying him." Kane, overhearing them, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's nothing you can offer me. Whitmore owns judges, marshals, everything. You hand me over, I'll be out in a week. And then I'll come back to finish the job. This time, I won't miss. Ada walked up to him, her shadow falling over his face. You're right, she said calmly. We can't offer you anything, but we can offer your men a deal. She raised her voice, addressing the other captured thugs. Kane here was ready to kill all of you to clean up his own mess. He works for Whitmore, but you worked for a dead sheriff. Your pay is gone. Right now, you're accessories to murder. But if you testify against Kane, against Whitmore, I will speak to the marshal on your behalf. A full confession for a reduced sentence. She let the offer hang in the air. The men looked at each other, then at Kane, whose face had turned pale with fury. His loyalty was only as deep as his wallet, and his men knew it. One by one, they began to nod. The conspiracy was beginning to unravel. But as they gathered their prisoners and prepared for the long, dangerous ride to New Houston, a new figure appeared on the ridge. A boy, no older than 20, riding a tired-looking mare. He was one of the men who had been with Dodd, but he had fled during the gunfight. Now he was coming back. He rode into the barnyard, dismounted, and approached Ida with his hands raised, his face pale with fear. Ma'am, he stammered. Miss Holloway, I have to tell you something. You were with them, Clayton said, stepping forward, his hand on his gun. Yes, the boy admitted, his eyes wide. But I didn't know. They told us. It's not just Whitmore. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. There's someone else. Someone above Whitmore. The telegrams, the orders. They came through him, but they didn't start with him. There's another name. A name no one is supposed to say. Clayton and Ida exchanged a look. The rabbit hole just kept getting deeper. They had cut off the head of the snake in Black Briar, but it was becoming terrifyingly clear that it was just one head of a much larger, more monstrous hydra. The boy, whose name was Jonah, was trembling so hard he could barely stand. He looked like a frightened rabbit caught between a pack of wolves and a forest fire. Clayton gave him a drink of water from his canteen, and Ida spoke to him in a calm, steady voice, trying to ease the boy's terror. Take a breath, son, she said. Now, tell us. What name? Jonah's eyes darted around nervously, as if the very air had ears. I only heard it once, he whispered, leaning in closer. Dodd was drunk one night, bragging. He said Whitmore was just the money, just the muscle. But the real power, the one who pulls the strings, is a man named Judge Alistair Monroe. Clayton felt a jolt, as if he'd been struck by lightning. Judge Monroe, not just any judge, the senior federal magistrate in New Houston. A man renowned for his iron fist and his unimpeachable reputation. He was a legend in the territory, a pillar of justice. If Monroe was involved, this conspiracy reached the very highest echelons of power. They weren't just fighting a company anymore, they were fighting the law itself. The judge, Ada said in disbelief. Why? Why would a man like that be involved in a land grab? Jonah shook his head frantically. I don't know, but Dodd said, he said the judge has a personal interest in the Holloway Valley, said it was old business. Old business, the same words Jeb had used. A chilling pattern was beginning to emerge, a tapestry woven from threads of greed, revenge, and secrets that went back generations. This wasn't just about land. This was a blood feud, orchestrated by one of the most powerful men in the territory. This changes everything, Clayton said, his mind racing. We can't just ride into New Houston and hand over Kane. Monroe will have him silenced before he can say a word. He'll bury that telegram and us with it. Silas, the old foreman, spat on the ground. So what do? We have the proof, we have the prisoners. We can't just sit here. No, Ada said, her voice steely. We don't sit. We adapt. She looked at the captured men, then at Clayton. A new, even more audacious plan was forming in her mind. New Houston is Monroe's fortress. We can't win a fight there on his terms. She paused, her eyes locking onto Clayton's. So we don't fight him there. We make him come here. Clayton raised an eyebrow. Monroe, come out here? He wants the deed, Ida explained, her voice quick and sharp. He wants me silenced. He thinks he's a ghost, pulling strings from the shadows. So we drag him into the light. She turned to Jonah. Does Monroe know that Dodd failed? Does he know I'm still alive? Jonah shook his head. No, ma'am. Kane was supposed to report back after it was done. Good, Ada said, a grim smile on her face. Then as far as he knows, the plan is still in motion. She looked at Kane, who was watching her with a newfound, grudging respect. You're going to send a telegram to Whitmore, and he's going to pass it along to the judge. You're going to tell them that Dodd is dead, but you have the girl and the original deed. You're going to tell them to meet you for the exchange. Exchange? Kane asked, a flicker of interest in his eyes. What's the price? Your life, Ada said coldly. You lead them into our trap. You play your part, and I will personally testify that you cooperated. You might still see the inside of a cell, but you won't see a noose. It was a devil's bargain, a gamble of epic proportions. They were going to use the conspirators' own network against them, luring the puppet master himself out of his stronghold and onto their battlefield. The plan was set. 2 of Silas's fastest riders were dispatched with Kane under armed guard to the telegraph station in the next town over, far from Blackbriar's prying eyes. They carried a carefully worded message that would appeal to the judge's arrogance and greed. The message was simple. Target secured. Deed acquired. Complications require your personal authorization for transfer. Await you at the Old Mission Pass. Come alone. The Old Mission Pass was a narrow, treacherous canyon, a natural bottleneck. It was a place where a small, determined group could hold off an army. As the riders disappeared over the horizon, Ada turned to Clayton. Now, we prepare for war. She looked at the remaining men, Silas, a few old loyalists, and the handful of Dodd's former thugs who had chosen to switch sides out of self-preservation. It was a ragtag army, a collection of ghosts and turncoats. It's not enough, Clayton said bluntly. If Monroe suspects a trap, he won't come alone. He'll bring hired guns, professionals. I know, Ada said, which is why we need more than guns. She looked at the Holloway barn, at the crest of the hawk carved into the wood. We need a symbol. We need the valley. She mounted her horse, her posture straight and proud. Silas, you and your men, ride. Spread the word again. But this time, don't just tell them I'm alive. Tell them what happened here. Tell them Sheriff Dodd was a traitor working for Whitmore. Tell them the judge in New Houston is trying to steal our valley. Tell them we have the proof. And tell them the last Holloway is making her stand at the Mission Pass. We are not asking for help. We are telling them that the time has come to choose a side, to stand with the lawless or to stand for the valley. It was a call to arms, a declaration of independence. She wasn't just fighting for her land anymore. She was fighting for the soul of every person who lived there. As the men rode out, their faces set with a grim new purpose, Clayton found himself looking at Ida with a sense of awe. She had been shot and left for dead only days ago. Now she was commanding an insurrection against one of the most powerful men in the West. But as he watched her, a cold realization washed over him. Judge Alistair Monroe. He knew that name not just by reputation, he knew it from his past. Monroe had been the prosecuting attorney in the case that had made Clayton turn in his badge. A case where a wealthy landowner had gotten away with murder because of lost evidence and a confused jury. Monroe had expressed his regrets to Clayton personally, shaking his hand and speaking of the flawed nature of the justice system. Had it all been an act? Was the man he once looked up to the very embodiment of the corruption he had run away from? The coming battle at the Mission Pass wouldn't just be for a valley. For Clayton, It would be a confrontation with the ghosts of his own past, a final bloody test of the man he used to be and the man he had become. The stakes had just become deeply, dangerously personal. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic preparation. The mission pass was a natural fortress, a narrow slit in the towering rock walls of the canyon, with the ruins of an old Spanish mission standing guard at its entrance. It was a place of ghosts and echoes, a perfect stage for their final act. Clayton, using his half-forgotten skills as an army scout, directed the placement of their small force. He positioned riflemen on the high ledges, concealed in the rocks, with clear fields of fire into the canyon below. He had others set up barricades of rock and fallen timber within the pass itself, creating a series of choke points. It was a classic ambush designed to neutralize a superior force through strategy and terrain. Ada, meanwhile, was the heart of the operation. She moved among the men, her presence a source of quiet strength. The men from the valley had answered her call. They weren't soldiers. They were ranchers and farmers, men who were more comfortable with a branding iron than a rifle. But they had come. Dozens of them. They had seen the truth in Silas's words and the courage in Ida's stand. They came with their own hunting rifles, shotguns, and a fierce, protective love for their homes. The valley had chosen its side. Jonah, the boy who had turned on Dodd, proved to be an invaluable asset. Racked with guilt, he worked tirelessly, hauling rocks, setting up watch posts, his fear slowly being burned away by a newfound sense of purpose. He told Ida about secret trails, old smugglers' routes through the canyons that only the locals knew, information that could give them a crucial edge. On the evening of the second day, a lone rider approached their camp. It was one of the men who had taken Kane to the telegraph station. "He's coming," the rider reported, his voice breathless with excitement. The telegram came back. Just one word: tomorrow. A tense silence fell over the camp. The puppet master was taking the bait. Clayton found Ada standing at the entrance to the pass, looking out at the long, empty road that led from New Houston. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "I was born for this, Clayton," she said, not turning to look at him. "My whole life has been leading to this moment, to defend this place, but what about you? This isn't your fight." He stood beside her, his gaze following hers down the dark road. "It is now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Monroe. He was the man who made me quit the law. I watched him let a guilty man walk free because he was rich and powerful. I told myself he was just part of a broken system, but I was a coward. I ran instead of fighting him. I'm not running anymore." Their shared pasts, their separate wars, had converged into this one single point, this one battle. The morning dawned, cold and gray. A thick fog clung to the canyon floor, muffling sound and shrouding the world in a ghostly veil. It was perfect. The fog would hide their numbers and their positions, adding to the element of surprise. Every man was in his place. Silence descended. The only sound was the wind whispering through the rocks, like the ghosts of the old mission sighing in anticipation. Around midday, they heard it. The distant, rhythmic sound of horses' hooves. It wasn't one rider. It was many. Clayton peered through his spyglass from a high ledge. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a small group of hired guns. It was a private army. At least 30 riders, all dressed in black dusters, armed with repeating rifles, moving with disciplined precision. And at their head, riding a magnificent black stallion, was a man in a fine city suit. Even from this distance, Clayton could feel the man's aura of absolute power and arrogance. But it was the man riding beside him that made Clayton's heart stop. It was Whitmore. And chained between their horses, forced to stumble along on foot, was Kane. The judge hadn't come alone. He had brought his attack dog, and he had brought the bait. But there was something else. A third figure riding slightly behind Monroe, a man whose face was hidden by the deep shadow of his hat. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he sat his horse. The trap was set. But looking at the small army advancing on them, Clayton had a sickening feeling that he and Ida were not the only ones who had laid a trap today. Judge Monroe's army entered the mouth of the canyon, their pace slowing as they navigated the rocky terrain. The thick fog swirled around them, creating an eerie, claustrophobic atmosphere. Monroe radiated an impatient fury. He had been drawn out of his comfortable seat of power, forced into the dirt and grime of the frontier, and he did not like it. "Where is she?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. From the ruins of the old mission, Ada stepped out into the open. She stood alone, a solitary figure against the crumbling adobe walls. She held the original deed in her hand. Monroe's eyes, cold and reptilian, fixed on her. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Ida Holloway, the ghost who refuses to die. I should have known your father's stubbornness would pass to you." He gestured impatiently. "Give me the deed. Your pathetic little rebellion is over." "This is no rebellion, Alistair," Ida called back, her voice ringing with a strength that defied her isolation. "This is a reclamation. This valley is not for sale." Monroe chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Everything is for sale, girl. Your father knew that. In fact, he was the one who taught me the lesson." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "Did he ever tell you how he acquired the Henderson place, or the water rights to the South Ridge? He didn't win them, he bought them, with my family's money. He was my father's business partner, you see. Until he cheated him, ruined him, and left him to die penniless." Ida stared, speechless. The judge's words hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just revenge for a lost business deal. This was a blood feud, born from a betrayal she had never known. "My family's name was Monroe," the judge continued, his voice dripping with decades of stored venom. "But we had to change it when we were run out of this territory in disgrace. Your father didn't just steal our land. He stole our past. I have spent 30 years clawing my way back to power. 30 years planning this moment. I will not just take this valley back. I will erase the Holloway name from history." Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. The old business, the personal interest. It all made a horrifying kind of sense. From his perch, Clayton watched, his rifle trained on the judge. This was the moment. He gave the signal. The first shot came from a high ledge, taking out one of Monroe's guards. Immediately, the canyon erupted. The ranchers opened fire from their hidden positions, their shots echoing like thunder. Monroe's men, caught completely by surprise, scattered for cover, firing blindly into the fog. The battle was joined. But Monroe was prepared. "Whitmore!" he roared. "Now!" Whitmore grinned, pulling a strange, cylindrical object from his saddlebag. It was dynamite. He lit the fuse and hurled it, not at the riflemen on the ledges, but at the base of the canyon wall, near a pile of loose rock and scree that Clayton had noted earlier. The explosion was deafening. The ground shook, and a massive section of the canyon wall gave way, triggering a landslide. A river of rock and earth cascaded down, completely blocking the entrance to the pass. They were trapped. Clayton's ambush had become their tomb. Monroe's men, recovering from the initial shock, now had clear targets. The ranchers, their positions exposed by the shifted landscape, were pinned down. The tide of the battle had turned in a heartbeat. "You see, Miss Holloway?" Monroe shouted over the gunfire, his voice filled with triumphant rage. "I learned from your father. Always have a contingency. Always control the battlefield." Through the smoke and chaos, Clayton saw the third rider, the one whose face had been hidden, finally move. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a pair of revolvers. As he came into the light, Clayton's blood froze. It was Jeb, the man Ida had shown mercy to, but he wasn't aiming at Ida. He rode past her, his face a mask of grim determination, and opened fire on Judge Monroe's men. "The Holloways owe my family a debt!" he screamed. "But my war is with them, not with the valley. You will not take our home, Monroe." Jeb's sudden, shocking intervention threw Monroe's forces into confusion, giving the pinned-down ranchers a desperately needed moment to regroup. It was an act of suicide, a final, desperate attempt at redemption. In that same instant, Clayton saw his own chance. Monroe, distracted by Jeb's kamikaze charge, had turned his back. Clayton lined up the shot, his finger tightening on the trigger. It was the shot he had been waiting for his entire life. The chance to finally bring the corrupt judge to justice. But just as he was about to fire, he saw Ida. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was running towards the landslide, towards a small opening in the rock fall. And then he saw why. Young Jonah had been caught in the rock slide, his leg pinned under a massive boulder. He was trapped, helpless, right in the middle of the crossfire. Clayton was faced with an impossible choice. Take the shot and kill Monroe, the architect of all this pain, the man who represented everything he hated, and let Ida and Jonah die in the ensuing chaos. Or abandon his post, abandon his one chance for personal vengeance, and try to save them, knowing that Monroe might escape in the process. The man he used to be screamed at him to take the shot, to fulfill his duty. But the man he had become knew there was no choice at all. Cursing, he lowered his rifle and scrambled down from the ledge, running, unarmed, into the heart of the firefight. The canyon was a living nightmare of ricocheting bullets, panicked shouts, and the screams of wounded men. Clayton ran, his lungs burning, his mind a white-hot blank of pure focus. He ignored the bullets whizzing past his head, ignored the chaos of the battle. His entire world had narrowed to two people: Ida, desperately trying to move a boulder that wouldn't budge, and Jonah, pale and bleeding at her feet. Jeb's suicidal charge bought them precious seconds. He rode like a demon, his pistols blazing, sowing chaos among Monroe's professional gunmen. He took down 2, then 3, before a volley of rifle fire cut him from his saddle. He fell, his brief, violent act of redemption complete. He had died not for revenge, but for the valley. Clayton reached Ida's side. "Get back!" he yelled, putting his shoulder to the massive rock. He pushed, his muscles screaming in protest. It was no use. It was too heavy. "It's no good," Ida cried, her face streaked with dust and tears. "We can't move it." Whitmore, seeing them exposed and helpless, raised his rifle, a cruel grin spreading across his face. This was the end. He had them. Suddenly, from a hidden smuggler's trail that Jonah had pointed out earlier, Silas and a handful of ranchers appeared. They had used the chaos to circle around Monroe's flank. They opened up a devastating crossfire on Whitmore and his men. Whitmore grunted as a bullet tore through his shoulder, his shot going wide. He staggered back, cursing, and retreated behind cover. The tide had turned again. Clayton saw his chance. "The dynamite!" he yelled to Ida, pointing at the satchel on the saddle of a dead horse nearby. "Get it!" While she scrambled for the explosives, Clayton ripped a piece of his shirt, handing it to Jonah. "Press this on the wound! Hard!" He then turned back to the rock, searching for a crack, a fissure, anywhere he could place a charge. Ida returned with the dynamite. Clayton, his hands moving with practiced speed, wedged a stick into a crevice beneath the boulder pinning Jonah's leg. He cut a short fuse. "This is going to be close," he shouted. "When I light it, run! Don't look back!" He lit the fuse, the spark fizzling angrily. He grabbed Ida's arm and pulled her, stumbling, away from the blast zone. They dove behind a rock outcropping, just as the dynamite exploded with a deafening crack. Shards of rock flew like shrapnel. When the dust settled, they saw that the boulder had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Jonah was free. His leg was mangled, but he was alive. Meanwhile, the battle raged. Monroe, Seeing his army being whittled down by the rancher's superior knowledge of the terrain, realized the fight was lost. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the cold, reptilian instinct for survival. He grabbed the reins of Whitmore's horse, abandoning his wounded lieutenant without a second thought, and spurred the animal toward the only way out, a narrow, treacherous goat trail that led up the side of the canyon. He was escaping. Clayton saw him. He grabbed a rifle from a fallen rancher. This was it, the last chance. He raised the rifle, his eye sighting down the barrel. Monroe was a distant figure now, a silhouette against the gray sky. It was an almost impossible shot. He took a breath, let it out slow, just as he'd been taught. He thought of the badge he'd thrown away, the justice he'd run from. He thought of Ida, of Jeb, of the valley. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Far up the trail, Monroe jerked in the saddle, then slumped forward, tumbling from his horse to disappear into the chasm below. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the whisper of the wind. It was over. They gathered in the aftermath, a weary, battered collection of survivors. Whitmore and the remnants of Monroe's army surrendered, their fight gone with the death of their leader. Silas helped Clayton make a splint for Jonah's leg, while Ida moved among the ranchers, tending to the wounded, her face a mask of sorrow and strength. They had won. They had saved the valley. But the cost had been high. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the canyon, Clayton found Ida standing over Jeb's body. She looked down at the man who had tried to kill her, the man who had ultimately saved her. "He called it a debt," she said quietly. "He was right. My family wasn't perfect, Clayton. They built our legacy on another family's sorrow. The justice we fought for today. It has to be for everyone, or it's not justice at all." Clayton looked at her, at the fire and the grace that burned within her. She hadn't just reclaimed her land. She had reclaimed its honor. He found the judge's body at the bottom of the ravine. In his coat pocket was a leather-bound journal. Clayton opened it. It was filled with Monroe's cramped, angry script. Decades of resentment, plans for revenge, and detailed records of his corrupt dealings. It documented everything: the bribes, the murders, the conspiracy to steal the Holloway land. But it also contained something else. It contained the original, notarized partnership agreement between his father and Ida's grandfather. It proved that Ida's grandfather had, in fact, illegally squeezed his partner out of the business, using legal loopholes to seize full control. Jeb had been telling the truth. The foundation of the Holloway empire was built on a crime. This journal was the final, devastating secret. It was proof that could destroy not only Monroe's reputation, but the Holloway legacy forever. He could burn it. He could throw it into the chasm and let the secrets die with the judge. No one would ever know. Ida's claim would be absolute, her family's name cleared. But as he stood there, the journal in his hand, he looked back up at Ida, who was now helping lift Jonah onto a makeshift stretcher. He saw the integrity in her eyes, the hard-won wisdom in her face. He knew what he had to do. Justice, she had said, had to be for everyone. He climbed back up the cliff face and walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He just handed her the journal. Weeks turned into months, and a new season began to breathe life back into the valley. The long, bloody shadow of Judge Monroe's conspiracy receded, replaced by the warm light of a hard-won peace. The journal Clayton had given Ida became the instrument of a new kind of justice. Armed with Monroe's detailed records, federal marshals from outside the territory descended upon New Houston, and the judge's vast, corrupt network was systematically dismantled. Whitmore, faced with irrefutable proof and the testimony of his own men, confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser sentence. The men who rode with Dodd and Kane faced trial, but on Ida's recommendation, those who had helped in the final battle, like Jonah, received pardons. The valley was finally, truly free. But Ida did not simply reclaim her family's empire. The journal had changed her. It revealed the tainted origins of her legacy, and she refused to build a future on a rotten foundation. She made a decision that shocked the entire territory. Using the proof from the journal, she legally acknowledged the original crime committed by her grandfather. She went to the descendants of the Henderson family and the other smaller families who had been pushed out by the Holloway's ruthless expansion. She didn't just give them money, she gave them land. She redrew the boundaries of the Holloway ranch, carving out tracts of the most fertile ground and deeding it back to the families who had been wronged generations ago. It was an act of atonement, an act of justice that echoed far beyond the valley's borders. She wasn't just giving back the land, she was restoring the honor of her own name. The Holloway ranch was smaller now, but its foundations were, for the first time, built on solid, honest ground. She chose not to rebuild the grand ranch house that had been burned to the ground. Instead, she and the community worked together to restore the old mission at the pass, turning it into a town hall and a school. The place of their bloodiest battle became their symbol of unity. She lived in a modest new house nearby, its porch facing the valley she had fought for. Clayton stayed. He had found his own peace, not in a badge or a gun, but in the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. He put away his revolver and picked up a hammer, working alongside the ranchers, his past finally laid to rest. He was no longer running, he was home. One evening, as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and purple, he sat with Ida on her porch, looking out at the peaceful valley. Lights twinkled from new homesteads, and the sound of distant laughter carried on the breeze. "You could have been the queen of this whole territory," he said quietly, "richer than any of them." She smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. "Some things are worth more than land, Clayton. My father taught me to protect my legacy, but he never told me I could redefine it." She looked at the valley. Her valley. "This is a better legacy, one that doesn't need to be defended with guns, but with community, with trust." He looked at her, at the last Holloway, who had proven that true strength wasn't about holding on to power, but about having the courage to share it. The cycle of violence and revenge that had haunted this land for generations was finally broken. The story of Ida Holloway became a legend in the West. A story not just of survival, but of renewal. A story of how one woman, armed with nothing but the truth and an unbreakable will, faced down an empire and reminded an entire valley that justice is not something you own, but something you build together. The Holloway name wasn't carved in marble or stone. It was written in the deeds she gave away, in the fences that were mended, and in the trust she had restored. And that was a legacy that would never die. If you enjoyed this story and believe that one person's courage can change the world, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of history.